us this evening. I'm so happy to be here in the beautiful Chaplain B. Barnes reading room inside the Lanphear Livery with another presentation of the Conservancy's Lanphear Live series. My name is Jocelyn Leahy. I'm the Executive Director of the Conservancy. You may have seen me moseying about at the back of the room or offering refreshments, but tonight I'm here and excited to welcome you to our presentation. If you haven't seen our lineup for the rest of the season of Lanphear Live, please grab a flyer on your way out. After this evening, we have 3 presentations left, and they're sure to be enjoyable. We also have a very special presentation lined up next Tuesday at 4 p.m. rather than 6 p.m., and that's Dr. Beauregard. He is the world's foremost expert on ospreys. And we actually have 3 osprey platforms on Napatry, so this is a really exciting presentation for us. Leslie and Walter Tomlinson were so generous in lining up this presentation. We're very excited to have Dr. Beauregard here, and we're hopeful that you're able to come as well. Again, this presentation is on a Tuesday, not a Monday, and it's at 4 p.m., not 6 p.m. And that's because the concert series in the park is coming back, and we don't want to conflict with their schedule as well. I wanted to offer my thanks to a couple of people this evening. First, I'd like to thank Janice Sassy for coordinating and scheduling the Lanphear Live series. She does an amazing job reaching out to the speakers and making those connections for the Conservancy, and we can't thank her enough for all the effort that goes into this. While it's a short summer season, her work is all year long on this matter, so thank you, Janice. I also want to thank the Conservancy Board of Directors. They're supportive in everything that the Conservancy does, and they're very generous with their time in attending these events, helping us put them on and schedule them, and we really appreciate their representation at all of our events for the Conservancy. And of course, Grant Simmons, thank you again for making us delicious treats this evening. Grant is a passionate, committed member of the Conservancy and the community, and so I'm sure you all know, but you know, his delicious contributions here are just the tip of the iceberg on what he does for the Conservancy and for all of us. So thank you, Grant. We appreciate you. And finally, I want to thank Brian Wallin for joining us this evening. I'm excited to hear a bit of the history that you're bringing for us. And without anything else from me, one thing though. If you're new, I see some new faces this evening, and maybe that's because I'm still relatively new. But if you're interested in getting our emails, please sign up on the sheet over there that I've put out, because you'll hear about the Lanphear Live schedule and other programming that's going on, and that will help us know how to reach you. So thank you for that. Pete, I'd like to introduce Pete August, who is the Napatry Science Advisor Chair and also the Vice President of the Conservancy. Thanks, Pete.
Jocelyn, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Nice, cool evening, isn't it? We'll take this. It really cooled down nicely and a great breeze. So tonight's speaker, as Jocelyn mentioned, is Brian Wallin, who will tell us the story of Ida Lewis, Rhode Island's most famous lighthouse keeper and an American legend. His tales of Ida might be the second most interesting human story you hear tonight. Brian's story is fascinating as well. Like cats that have 9 lives, Brian has had many, many successful careers. Brian has a special skill in communications, which we'll discover this evening. After completing his undergraduate and graduate degrees in 1968, Brian was a news reporter, then a television anchor, and then a news producer in various markets in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. One of his specialties was covering the America's Cup yacht races between 1967 and 1983. In those days, the U.S. was the team to beat, and the races were held in Newport. And his reporting was carried internationally. In his spare time, he served on the faculty of Salve Regina University and Providence College. Brian then turned to healthcare administration and served that profession for 25 years. He retired as vice president of Kent Hospital. Retirement provided Brian the time to pursue his real passion, studying the history of the people, places, and events in Rhode Island. He's a prolific author, prolific speaker on all matters of our history. He's a trustee of the Barnum Military Museum in East Greenwich. Oh, and did I mention he's an accomplished guitarist, a marine model builder, and he does voiceovers for documentaries. Please join me in welcoming Brian Wallin.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you, Jocelyn, for that very kind introduction. It is a delight to be here tonight. I had a chance, thanks to Janice, to have a little look at the Lanphear facility, and it is just magnificent. There is so much history in our beloved state, and one of the things that we as historians try to do is to keep history alive. And it's such a challenge today, especially with young people, to do that. So programs like this, if we can take these stories and share them with our children and our grandchildren, that's what it's all about. I would like to acknowledge quickly the following for providing some of the information and the images in tonight's presentation. I drew from the Library of Congress, the National Archives, the United States Navy's Naval History and Heritage Command, the Ida Lewis Yacht Club, of course, the Newport Historical Society, the Jamestown Historical Society, the Newport Library, the Bridgeport, Connecticut Public Library, Bridgeport, Connecticut, yep, and the North Kingstown Free Library, the Steamship Historical Society of America, District 1 of the U.S. Coast Guard, the Office of the Historian of the U.S. Coast Guard, and the American Lighthouse Foundation. So with all of that, let me introduce you to the lighthouse, a comforting beacon to sailors across the world. Nowadays, these gentle sentinels are, with rare exceptions, automated by modern technology. They employ sophisticated electronic communication and illumination, powered by electricity, or more frequently today by solar energy. But until the mid-20th century, it was the practice to have light keepers, men and women, closely associated to attending the lantern and ensuring its operation in darkness and foul weather. Now, we never had more than 1,000 lights in our country. Today, with the introduction of advanced navigational aids, there are fewer than 700, and that number continues to decline. Fortunately, some lights that were slated for destruction, even here in our own ocean state, have been saved thanks to private organizations. And we're going to see that, I think, continue just down the road here at the Watch Hill light. Others are still operated actively by the Coast Guard, but all aids to navigation are subject to Coast Guard regulations. So let me begin our story with a quick little look at Lighthouse 101. The earliest recorded lighthouse was built around 300 BC. The Light of Alexandria on the island of Pharos was an open fire on top of a tower, and that was it. Now, the oldest light station in America is Boston Light on Little Brewster Island. It was first lit in 1716. The current lighthouse is different. That's the original wooden tower in the center. And the current lighthouse, built in 1783, is on the left. Because of its historic importance, it is the only lighthouse that actually has a staff member present, although not as a light keeper, but as a docent. The light is automated, and the Coast Guard tender serves in that capacity as a guide to visitors. The second oldest light is Brant Point on Nantucket. That first was lit as a wooden tower in 1746, and the current light dates from 1856. 1856 was a big year for lighthouses. Rhode Island boasts the third oldest lighthouse in the country, Beavertail. A 68-foot tall enclosed wooden tower was first lit here in 1749. It burned to the ground in 1753 and was replaced by the light that's there on the right. Now, this is a 1778 French sketch. It is probably one of the only surviving images of the light. It was a stone structure that was heavily damaged by the British when they beat it out of town in 1779. They actually stole the optics of the beacon out of the tower. They also damaged the interior, and so in 1856, that structure was replaced by the current 62-foot high granite tower. The 1938 hurricane revealed the original foundation of that 1749 light, seen there on the right. There's a new beacon in the light, by the way, installed just in June of 2019. It weighs only 30 pounds. It uses 8 acrylic Fresnel prism lenses, and I'll tell you a little bit about Fresnel in a minute. Inside that device is a 50-watt LED light bulb. It can be seen from 11 miles away. That is how well that light is engineered. Now, at first, candles were used in the lights, some in candelabras, others simply single candles with mirrored reflectors. You can imagine how well that looked. The large candle on the left, by the way, is from the Eddystone light in England. That was the original light there. But these sorts of devices obviously were impractical. The individual candles only lasted about 3 hours. And by the 19th century, there were more sophisticated lanterns like the one on the right that used various types of fuel oil. Whale oil was very popular. Vegetable oil and even lard oil was being employed. By 1870, kerosene was the preferred fuel. In the 1880s, wherever possible, electricity took over. In fact, the first light to be powered by electricity here in America, guess what? The Statue of Liberty in 1886. And it actually served as a lighthouse, an aid to navigation in New York Harbor for about 17 years. So here's our friend Auguste Fresnel. We'll use the Americanized pronunciation. I get corrected all the time on the Rhode Island Fast Ferry Lighthouse cruises, but there are 3 different pronunciations. So Augustin Jean Fresnel invented a prism lens that really magnified the light source. We won't get into the physics, but you can see how a small light can be greatly magnified and makes a much more powerfully projected beam. In America, Fresnel's lenses were adopted by the federal government's lighthouse agency around the mid-19th century and pretty much standardized, and there are still Fresnel lenses in use here in Rhode Island. In colonial days, lighthouses were built, staffed, and managed by local communities. Now you can imagine how that went. If you were so-and-so's brother-in-law, you could be the lighthouse tender. Political patronage rather than ability. So there was all kinds of variation in quality. So one of the first acts of the new government was to create the United States Lighthouse Establishment in 1789 under the Treasury Department. And they took over the management of beacons. In 1847, the U.S. Lighthouse Board was a professional body of military officers and civilians. In 1903, lighthouse keepers become civil service employees under the Department of Commerce. And you'll see what that did to poor Ida Lewis. And there they stayed until the whole operation was turned over to the Coast Guard in 1939, where it remains today. And that is Lighthouse 101. No quiz. Now, the lightkeeper's life was often lonely, frequently dangerous. Numerous keepers lost their lives in the course of their duties. Most lighthouses had to have 2 tenders on duty, since the clockwork mechanisms of the lights and other devices, such as the fog signals, required constant attention. Most keepers were men, but there were a number of lady keepers, and most of them took over on the death of their husband, but some were directly appointed. Now that's Fanny Salter down at Turkey Point in Maryland back in 1945. The subject of our story, Ida Lewis, followed her father and then her mother as the keeper of the Ida Lime Rock Light. For lights that were located on shore, duty was a little more palatable. Keepers could supplement their income by raising small crops and livestock. They didn't make much money back then. And they were usually staffed by family men accordingly. Offshore lights were considered to be a hardship appointment. And we had several of those in Rhode Island. Interestingly enough, a Dutch island light in the middle of the West Passage was considered a hardship light because it was on an island, even though you could look right across and there was land. They were granted permission to have their families in some of them too, as was the keeper of the Dutch island light. So let's come back to Rhode Island. At one point, we had 31 lights and a pair of lightships. Realize we had 2 lightships here once? The other one was up at Hog Island, and that was eventually replaced by a lighthouse. Some lights were just decommissioned, others were replaced by buoys, and today all of them are automated. The last station to be automated was right here in Watch Hill in 1947 at the lower right. And that little walk through history brings us to the story of one of the most famous light keepers of all. Meet the legendary Lady Light Keeper of Lime Rock, Newport's own Idawalley Zoradia Lewis. Now, she was a quiet and unassuming young woman whose bravery and dedication earned her international fame, but who, during her life of service that spanned 6 decades out there on Lime Rock, she always maintained a shy and a modest personality. Just inside Newport Harbor is a dangerous limestone outcropping about 220 yards from shore, east of Fort Adams, opposite Goat Island. Originally called Lime Rock, it posed a surprising and a dangerous hazard to sailors entering the waters of the busy port. During the 18th century, Newport, of course, had become a major trading center on the East Coast, but the British occupation during the Revolution pretty much devastated that thriving economy. However, by the 1850s, things were starting to come back. The steamboat had arrived. The city by the sea was becoming a popular summer resort, drawing the elite of society. Fort Adams had become a major Army coast defense facility. It took them over 30 years to build that fort the way it stands today, by the way. Steamships were coming and going in increasing numbers. They brought tourists. Steamers and large schooners carried cargo and passengers up and down the bay. Most of them used the West Passage, by the way. And in 1853, the U.S. Lighthouse Board set aside $1,000 to put up a modest navigational aid on Lime Rock. For their money, that's pretty much what they got. A little stone tower isolated on the largest group of rocks, reachable only by rowing from shore. A wooden shack was built to provide some shelter where the keeper had to stay. Now, we have no images of that first light. It did, however, have a Fresnel lens in its lantern. It was probably not unlike this one. This is the Rubicon light that overlooks Lake Tahoe in California side. And needless to say, the little light and rowing back and forth proved to be impractical. The first keeper was a 49-year-old guy by the name of Hosea Lewis. He was serving as a pilot for the Revenue Cutter Service, the predecessor of the U.S. Coast Guard, when he landed the job as lightkeeper. Lewis brought his wife and family to Newport, and they settled in this house. It's still there at 283 Spring Street, right on the corner of Brewer Street, across from what today is Aquidneck Park. After the death of his first wife, Hosea remarried in 1838 to a lady by the name of Idawalley Zoradia Willie. She was the daughter of a Block Island doctor, and they had several children. The first child, a girl, died at the age of 10. Their second was a daughter. She was born on February 25, 1842, and named after her mother. She would be known simply as Ida. A few years later, the Lewises had another daughter by the name of Hattie. She would spend most of her life as an invalid. And finally, they had two sons. Hosea, who was known as Hosey, and Thomas Rudolph, who was known as Rude. Well, by the time she was a young teenager, Ida had become accomplished oarswoman. She would frequently accompany her father and row their small skiff across the harbor, often in bad weather, to tend the light. She learned how to handle a small boat expertly under her father's watchful eye. And also, she became a very accomplished swimmer. In 1857, cost of about $1,500, the government built a small but comfortable hip-roofed brick house with a 13-foot-tall chimney-like structure, a light tower facing the harbor. It is the building that remains today on that rock. In October, just 4 months after moving in, Hosea would suffer a stroke that left him an invalid for the rest of his life, and his wife and his teenage daughter took over his duties. Except for a brief period later in life, Ida would never leave Lime Rock. By the age of 15, Ida was rowing her siblings ashore so they could continue to attend school, but her school days were over. Her life as a lightkeeper had begun. As well as being able to handle that heavy skiff very skillfully, Ida was also an accomplished swimmer, which was unusual for a woman in those days. When her life-saving experiences became known, somebody even questioned whether or not it would be appropriate for a young woman to do that sort of thing, and Ida didn't mince words. In her plain, simple style, she said none but a donkey would consider it unfeminine to save lives. She cut right to the heart of things. Well, the period between the Revolution and the Civil War, as we said, was kind of quiet in Newport. Lime Rock overlooked a slowly changing environment. Progress came back to the city and its harbor. By the mid-century, the Army had completed that massive Fort Adams, protecting the entrance to the bay, and a large contingent of soldiers would continue to be there, off and on, right up through the end of the Second World War. In fact, the fort wasn't decommissioned by the Army until 1950. Well, the arrival of the steamboat, the completion of Fort Adams, the growth of the Navy's presence in Newport, which is a whole other story for another time, and most importantly, the discovery of Newport as a summer getaway by the wealthy of the Gilded Age gave rise to a major increase in harbor traffic. The entrances to Narragansett Bay from Rhode Island Sound can be a challenge, even to experienced mariners. I'm sure there are sailors in the audience who know exactly what I'm talking about, today being a perfect example. Located just inside the harbor, Lime Rock was not immune to those vagaries of the weather. Sudden squalls, treacherous tides are frequent, rock outcroppings and shallow waters pose dangerous to marine craft of all sizes, and fog, example in this image that I took one morning, is especially dangerous. You can barely see the lighthouse across the harbor. That was taken from Parati Park, so you can see how poor the visibility is, and to boot, the bay would frequently freeze over in the winter. In fact, at one time, the West Passage up here in 1918 froze over so solidly people could drive their horse and wagon or their cars across from Saunderstown to Connecticut. The operators of the great passenger steamers running up and down the bay from Providence and Fall River, of course, stopped at Newport, then went on to and from New York. They were constantly after the Lighthouse Board to improve aids to navigation around the bay and approaching from Rhode Island Sound. And a few cases, like the southern tip of Goat Island and the north end of Connecticut, and on Gould Island, the steamboat companies even erected their own lights, eventually shaming the government into taking some activity on their own. After taking her younger siblings to shore for school and back, and handling the household duties with her mother, Ida would clean the lantern and tend the light with her mother, often sleeping in a little room next to the glass lantern area on the side of the house facing the harbor. Caring for the lantern was a meticulous process by any light keeper. It required great care of the lens. That glass was very, very delicate. The fueling and the wicks had to be maintained. In many cases, winding the clockwork mechanisms that kept the lights rotating. In the case of Lime Rock, that wasn't the case. It was a fixed beacon. Fortunately, that wasn't necessary, as we said, and it just shone a plain, straight white light. Now, that, by the way, is an image of Ida tending the light, and you can see she was only about 5'4", weighed about 95 pounds. She had to stand on a step stool to reach the light. And that is the light that she tended. It is on display today in the Ida Lewis Yacht Club. For a period of time, it was in the custody of the Historical Society in Newport, but they did return it to the Yacht Club. Well, in 1858, barely 16 years old, Ida started responding to calls for help in the unpredictable waters around the light. Her first rescue involved 4 boys from well-to-do families. They were students at a local private school. They never acknowledged Ida's bravery, however, until over time their names became uncovered by the local newspapers. One was Samuel Camberlang Powell. Another, Theodore King, was the son of a physician. The third, Lance de Jong, was the son of a military officer stationed in Newport. And the fourth boy, we only know his name, was Smith. Well, the 4 of them had taken a friend's boat out for a joyride. They were coming back from the Dumplings, that rocky area along the East Passage. They had just rounded Fort Adams in the growing darkness, and all of a sudden one of them stood up, started horsing around, and climbed up on the mast. The boat began to rock. Their laughter turned to shouts for help, and the boat capsized, throwing them into the water. Ida heard them from the nearby lighthouse, dashed into the davits holding the lighthouse dory. Now again, barely 5'4", little over 100 pounds, but a powerful oarswoman, and she maneuvered her dory to the boys and pulled them over the stern. Her father had taught her the proper way to get people back into a boat. She got them back to Lime Rock. Her mother gave them all hot drinks and dried their clothes, and the boys went home and never said a word about what happened. The story didn't come to light until 40 years later, when Ida's fame had already spread worldwide. She had never thought to mention it because it was just the right thing to do. Ironically, one of the boys, Samuel Powell, outlived Ida, and he would serve as a pallbearer at her funeral in 1911. But that was just the beginning to her storied history. In 1866, 3 soldiers on their way back to Fort Adams after a night of drinking in Newport. What? Soldiers, sailors drinking? No, didn't happen. Well, they needed a skiff to get back, and they hijacked one from the local dock. Of all things, it happened to belong to Ida's brother. Partway, one of the men put his foot through the hull. 2 of them disappeared during the incident. They either drowned or they deserted. History is silent about that. But the 3rd man floated with the slowly sinking rowboat until Ida came to the scene. She hauled his waterlogged form into the boat, and no one bothered to thank her. In 1867, 3 men escorting a valuable sheep that belonged to August Belmont, the wealthy banker and diplomat. He had a beautiful summer home in Newport. The sheep dove into the water, and the men chased after it in the chilly, choppy waters aboard a small boat. But they'd quickly overwhelmed them, And once again, Ida, ever watchful, rescued the trio and then went back and hauled the frightened, soaking wet sheep into the boat. Again, no recognition. Well, in spite of these and other likely unrecorded rescues, now remember, she was doing this and she never bothered to write it down. It was an event in 1869 that propelled Ida into international spotlight because of a particularly dramatic rescue that had gained the attention of the news media. She was compared to an English woman named Grace Darling. Grace was the daughter of the keeper of the Longstone Light, and in 1838, barely in her 20s, Grace was with her parents in the lighthouse when she spotted a steamship that had run aground and was foundering, breaking up within sight of the lighthouse. She and her father in a small boat rowed out, and they rescued 5 survivors of the wreck. The remaining 57 perished, but the daring event earned Grace Darling international fame. Sadly, she would die of tuberculosis in 1842. She was only 26. But it was Grace Darling to whom Ida was originally compared. In fact, Ida easily surpassed that single dramatic achievement that gave Grace Darling her moment in fame. But Ida thought very highly of Grace, and for the rest of her life, she kept a framed picture of the English woman in her room. At last, an event occurred that brought her some attention. Since Fort Adams is located on the outer edge of Newport, it was not uncommon for soldiers to keep the shortest way back to their quarters. On March 28, 1869, Sergeant James Adams, hopefully no relation to John, and Private John McLaughlin, after a night of tavern hopping, they did it again, decided it would be quicker to get back to the fort by water. A 14-year-old boy was showing them the way across the harbor when a sudden snowstorm kicked up. A squall, the harbor turned turbulent, the boat capsized, tossing the boy in the water, and the sailors clung to the overturned skiff. Ida's mother, Zoradia, saw what happened and called to her daughter. Now, Ida was suffering from a cold, but that didn't stop her. Ignoring her father's words of warning, Ida, failing even to put on a coat or shoes, dashed into the lighthouse David area and launched the lighthouse boat. And both she and her brother pulled heavily on the oars and reached the struggling men. And with great effort, she pulled the 2 soldiers aboard, but sadly the boy was lost. Well, this time, her deed was rewarded as one of the grateful men presented her with a gold watch, and other tributes began to pour in. It marked the first public recognition of her bravery, but by far not the last. Most touching of all to Ida was a letter from the commanding officer of Fort Adams at the time, Major General Henry Hunt. And in it, he expressed the thanks of the men at the garrison that had taken up a collection, and the letter came with $218. That would be equivalent to about $4,000 today. Now, to give you an example, the average income of an ordinary lightkeeper back then was anywhere between $400 to $600 a year. So that was a lot of money, but in Ida's mind, it was merely the thought that counted. Although Ida was known locally, this is the rescue that propelled her into prominence. Newspapers and periodicals spread her story around the world. The New York Tribune sent a reporter and published a major story. This was Ida's 5th rescue, but the first to gain the attention. In the ensuing months and years, she brought considerable publicity to Newport itself. She was soon known as the Grace Darling of America. And here she is on the cover of the 1869 edition of Harper's Weekly. Young women began to copy, well, maybe some young men did too, began to copy the style in which she wore her scarf. You can see it's kind of an unusual area, tucked off to one side. Well, her rescues became front-page news. She began to get numerous awards. VIPs clamored to see her. A polka, the Ida Lewis Mazurka, was written in her honor. And another piece of music, The Ocean Waves Danced Highly, bore her image. She received a number of medals over the years, often accompanied by a cash award, but one by one, she put them aside and kept them in a little box. She was just not one to bask in her fame. The New York Benevolent Society sent her $100 and this silver medal on May 5th of 1869, and others would be on the way. The city of Newport was not to be outdone. On July 4th of 1869, they celebrated Ida in a big way. The holiday was declared Ida Lewis Day. Now remember, Ida would be considered a member of the working class She was by no means any equal to the elite who had begun to come to Newport and enjoy their summers, but the city did her proud. More than 4,000 people lined the city's main streets, dressed in their finery. Many of the women wore scarves tied in the style that Ida had worn in those publicity pictures, and all of them wanted to see the 27-year-old heroine. The height of the day's events would be the presentation of a handsome new life-saving dory valued at some $250, again, about $4,000 today, and here it is. This was the dory Rescue. Donors large and small, including President Grant himself, contributed to its purchase. The boat was paraded through the streets, all marveled at its beauty. 14 feet long, made of cedar, black walnut, and oak. It had plush, dark red cushions and 4 walnut oars. All of the fittings were polished copper. Now, bear in mind, this was not the kind of a boat that Ida would use on a daily basis, and it would have been overwhelming for her to have seen it. Rescued today is safely in the hands of the Newport Historical Society, which provided me with this image. By the way, you can see the flaked blue paint there. You can see the original paint was white on the boat. Well, it was a hot summer day. The flowery speeches in Washington Square went on, and Ida had no intention of getting up in front of an audience. She had never done it. To the end of her life, she would not do it. So when it came time to accept the handsome dory, it was a famed women's rights activist, Civil War veteran, abolitionist, Unitarian minister by the name of Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who spoke about Ida in these words, and I'll read it to you. Miss Lewis desires me to return her thanks for the donors and the citizens of Newport. She desires me to say that she has never made a speech in her life and doesn't expect to begin now. She receives the boat with pleasure, not alone as an earnest representation of the good feeling of her fellow citizens, but also as a means of doing a little more hereafter, if the occasion should come in the same direction. She has fortunately learned to do what the proverb recommends as the height of wisdom, to paddle her own canoe. And she will enable him to paddle this one, and if any of you should be so unfortunate as to get into difficulty in the neighborhood of Lime Rock, so long as you can see this boat riding at anchor there, it will say to you, as boys sometimes say to a playmate who has fallen, "Come here and I will pick you up." Miss Lewis is grateful to you for your acknowledgement of what seemed to her a simple act of duty, and she is more grateful to divine providence, which enabled her to do what she never hopes to have to do again. Well, several more presentations were made, including a set of silk flags for the officers of the passenger steamship Newport. Mercifully, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Ida finally stepped into her new dory, dressed in a black gown that she had bought just for the occasion, and accompanied by cannon saluting her, she rowed back alone to Lime Rock. And she thought that was the end of it, but it was only the beginning. She was on her way to becoming a legend. And incidentally, she had no place to keep that new boat. So a steamship magnate and financial speculator, you may have heard of Jim Fisk, an admirer of the brave young woman, quickly donated the cost of a small boathouse, and he also gave her a pair of expensive oarlocks. They went into that box with Ida's other treasured possessions. They were too nice to be used, too. Ida hoped to return to her life's work of tending the light with her mother and family, but it wasn't to be. That summer, she was literally inundated by thousands of people. Remember, the only way to get out there was by boat. Ida's father kept account, and he recorded between 9,000 and 10,000 visitors that year. The rich and the famous and everybody came calling. Now again, Ida would never be welcomed in high society, but nevertheless she did gain a measure of respect from those who met her in those days. They included politicians and elites like the Vanderbilts. The suffragettes Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton came to visit her. Generals, admirals, and even President Grant himself, and the list went on and on. Tributes and gifts poured in, along with offers of marriage, by the way. But Ida's first commitment was always to lovingly care for the light at Lime Rock. Now, Grant was arguably Ida's most famous visitor, although he didn't actually set foot on the rock. When he came to Newport, his schedule was crowded, but he insisted on meeting her. He was supposedly told he might get wet if he went to Lime Rock, and Grant was said to reply, "I'd get wet up to my armpits to meet Ida Lewis." Well, he didn't have to. Ida came to him. Dutifully, she boarded her beautiful dory Rescue and rowed across the harbor. She rarely used Rescue and preferred her old reliable dory, Courageous Child of Columbia, that hung on the davits at the lighthouse. But she figured the president, well, he had given some money towards it, so he deserved to look at it. Witnesses did say the meeting was brief. And Grant said to her, "I am happy to meet you, Miss Lewis, as one of the heroic noble women of the age." That same summer, Vice President Schuyler Colfax paid a visit, and that brings us now to the next chapter in Ida's life. Colfax's own cousin, Harriet Colfax, was the keeper of the Michigan City Light in Indiana, and he apparently felt a kindred spirit with Ida. Incidentally, Harriet's own story is a very interesting one and worth looking up. Well, the vice president was accompanied by his young wife and General Hunt from Fort Adams. Colfax and Ida had a pleasant talk, and oddly, as he was leaving, he asked her if she was engaged. His point was that if she married, she'd have to give up her maiden name and probably her fame. Ida retorted if she was to marry, she would take her husband's name and forget her fame. As it happens, she was engaged and already had been for a few years. Shortly after the Civil War, Ida had met a captain of a yacht by the name of William Hurd Wilson of Bridgeport, Connecticut. Remember I mentioned the Bridgeport Library? Here's where it comes in. His boat called at Newport. Ida's name became a household word, and it probably wasn't lost on Wilson, who pressed his case for marriage, and Ida finally did say yes. They were married on October 23rd of 1870 at the Methodist Episcopal Church on Thames Street. Now, history has not left us with an image of the captain and his bride, or for that matter, the captain. Ida left her beloved lighthouse, and she moved to Black Rock, a busy village on the shore of Long Island Sound in the city of Bridgeport. It turned out that William was off to sea much of the time, and Ida spent her days alone, looking wistfully at the nearby Fairweather Light and thinking of Lime Rock. Ironically, the keeper there was also a woman by the name of Kate Moore, and that's her in later life. Although she was never recognized to the level Ida was, she also performed several rescues in her work as a keeper, and to our knowledge, she and Ida never met. Ida's marriage soon floundered. She was miserable, and after barely 2 years, she returned to Lime Rock Light, never to leave it again. Along the way, she had become a devout Christian and accordingly had never divorced William Wilson. She did return to her maiden name after a while, but kept Wilson as a middle name, but never spoke publicly of her husband again. Perhaps another one of the reasons that Ida's return was prompted was the death of her father. He died on November 17th of 1872, and as we had mentioned, he had suffered a major stroke years ago. Ida and her mother and her siblings had cared for him in the light ever since. He was 68 years old. He is buried in Newport's Common Cemetery. The Lewis women, that is Ida on the left with her mother and her sister Hattie, they carried on life at Lime Rock. Visitors continued to arrive, mostly from curiosity. Remember again, the only way to get out there was by boat. She was always courteous, and people frequently took advantage of her. They'd often swipe little artifacts and memorabilia from the home just to say, see, I visited Ida Lewis. In 1877, the 35-year-old Ida performed another rescue, saving 3 soldiers whose boat had run aground on the rocks between the Light and Fort Adams. And this time, Ida became very ill after the rescue, and it took her several months to get well. At the same time, she was still caring for her ailing sister and picking up more and more of her mother's role because the elder Ida had begun to slip in her own health for a number of years, and she would die of cancer in 1887. As we noted, it wasn't uncommon for a widow to be named to succeed her husband as the lightkeeper, but Ida's mother was never formally appointed. The government just kept sending the check every month. There was no mechanism for her to be automatically named in his place, so the government just ignored it quietly. And as her mother's health steadily declined, it was Ida that carried on all of the duties and as well caring for her sister Hattie. Now, as we've said, she was not demonstrative by any means. She remained very modest in her demeanor and tended to shy away from publicity, but she was probably offended that she wasn't officially recognized as the keeper of the light, even after her mother's death. The government simply let things ride. Life went on. In 1878, her brother Hosea had married and moved off Lime Rock. He married a Catholic girl at St. Mary's Church and spent the rest of his life as a teamster in Newport. The news media, though, continued to publicize Ida's activities and had noted that the government hadn't formally recognized her as a keeper. Finally, it took the direct intervention of former governor, and by then U.S. Senator Ambrose Burnside to secure Ida's formal appointment effective January 21st of 1879. She was awarded the annual salary of $750. That made her the nation's highest paid lightkeeper at the time. of course, her tally of rescued continued to mount, and it was an event on the ice-covered waters of the harbor on February 4th of 1881 that would again propel her into Providence. 2 drunken Fort Adams soldiers, apparently they never learned their lesson. They had taken a shortcut from Newport across the ice, and suddenly they had a thin patch, and the ice gave way. Ida and her family were at dinner when the mother saw the men's plight, and once again, this time without a warm coat, Ida grabbed a piece of rope, called her brother rude, and tore out the door. The panic-stricken men were now practically frozen, and they dragged Ida into the water. Fully dressed in a voluminous clothing of the day, Ida still managed to drag herself and the men, with the help of her brother, to safety. The newspapers touted her bravery, and this time the government took official notice, and shortly after she was awarded a Congressional Gold Medal for life-saving. She received the medal in a ceremony on October 11th of that year in Newport. Now earlier, she had been made an honorary member of the Cirrhosis Society, a prominent professional women's organization, and she proudly wore their pin that day. She also had received a gold medal from the Humane Society in Massachusetts for her bravery. That's the medal that's there on the right. And that was a big deal because it had never been awarded outside the Commonwealth. Again, Ida never displayed any of these awards, and they still remained out of sight the way she preferred it. For the last 3 decades of her life, she pretty much stayed out of the public eye. Now and then there would be an article about her, like this one from a popular magazine of the period. The New York Times said of the Ida, "She never hears the voice of distress day or night without jumping into her little craft and proceeding to the scene of trouble." As we said, she had become a devout Christian. She was baptized at the Methodist Church in 1884, and she could often be seen sitting outside the light station in good weather reading her Bible. She continued to welcome friends, including young Elsie Vanderbilt, the young wife of Alfred Vanderbilt. Elsie came calling one day after the turn of the century, and she and Ida would remain friends until Ida's death. Again, very unusual occurrence. Ida had lost her sister Hattie in 1883. Her brother Hosea died a year later, and these deaths struck her mother very hard. Plagued by cancer again, her mother would die in 1887. And that left Ida and her brother Rude, and Ida's ever-present pet dog. She always had one by her side, usually a spaniel. She kept faithfully to her duties, but the changing times were catching up. Lightkeepers had become pretty much self-sufficient over the years, and the government gave only as much attention to them as they had to. But as the country grew, the bureaucracy grew with it. Lightkeepers became civil service employees in 1896, coming under the Department of Commerce, and with that came the ever-increasing watchfulness of the government bean counters hundreds of miles away. Time and again, Ida's work was questioned by clerks. More and more paperwork was demanded, and the attention to petty details took their toll. Remember, Ida was not well educated. As the early years of the new century rolled on, progress became more and more worrisome to the aging Ida. It was during this period in her early 60s that she accomplished the final documented rescues that would bring her number to 18. That number was really closer to 25. Fortunately for Ida, she had friends in high places, and one was Admiral George Dewey, the hero of Manila Bay. He's there on the left. She had named one of her beloved Cocker Spaniels Dewey in his honor. Another Navy friend was Admiral French Chadwick on the right. Chadwick had played a role in Ida's official appointment also. It was his wife that reached out to the philanthropist Andrew Carnegie in the hopes of getting recognition for Ida. Carnegie had established a famed life-saving award in 1904, but Ida wasn't eligible for them because most of her rescue had taken place before then. But Carnegie was so impressed with it that he personally set up a life stipend of $30 a month that he said would hopefully help Ida in retirement. Changes were coming quickly to the Lighthouse service in 1910. Ida was 68 years old and slowing down, although still receiving notice like the one that appeared in an article. The government was peering over her shoulder, and finally she got what was said to be a particularly insulting letter from Washington. Things were going to get worse. Among the many changes in the Lighthouse service was the introduction of automation, precluding the need for a keeper. And in 1911, Ida became increasingly worried this would be the fate of Lime Rock, and she was further stressed by what she perceived, and maybe rightfully so, as the constant nitpicking from Washington. On the morning of October 21st, 1911, Ida put out the lantern in the little tower room. In the course of getting breakfast for her and her brother Rude, Ida suffered a massive stroke. She fell into a coma and never regained consciousness. She died quietly at her beloved Lime Rock on the morning of October 24th at 69 years of age. And that night, every ship in Newport Harbor, including the mighty Fall River Line steamer Priscilla and the lighthouses in the area, tolled their bells in mourning in memory of Ida. The Newport Daily News, in reporting her death, made a point of blaming the government for contributing to her passing, and the city of Newport would give her one final and fitting tribute. Her body was brought ashore, taken to the Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Newport Mercury reported nearly 1,500 people were there to pay their respects, the simple people joined by the prominent. Carriages lined the street. Soldiers from Fort Adams were her pallbearers, joined by Samuel Powell, one of the young boys Ida had rescued way back in 1858. Ida was laid to rest in the nearby Common Ground Cemetery next to her family member. Her tombstone there simply reads, Ida Lewis, the Grace Darling of America, keeper of Lime Rock Light, Newport Harbor, born February 25, 1842, died October 24th of 1911, erected by her many kind friends. Root immediately notified the Lighthouse Bureau of Ida's death. In typical fashion of the day, they told him to keep things going and a new keeper would be on the way. And when he arrived, an experienced man by the name of Ivar Jensen, Root handed over the keys and he went to live with friends in Newport until he would die there in 1917. There was apparently never a thought that Root might succeed his famous sister. But Ida's pension from Andrew Carnegie was transferred to him. And Ida's medals, her beautiful dory, and other personal memorabilia were given over to the Newport Historical Society, where they remain today, including a beautiful filigreed silver teapot that was given to her by the soldiers at Fort Adams. Well, almost immediately, efforts got underway to rename the lighthouse and the rock in memory of Ida, but it took until 1924, a massive amount of paperwork and foot-dragging by the government before officials finally relented. The marine charts were changed, a resolution passed by the State General Assembly, and Lime Rock became officially Ida Lewis Rock and the lighthouse Ida Lewis Light. But the government almost simultaneously put into motion what would have been Ida's greatest fear. In 1927, the light was extinguished and replaced by an acetylene-powered lantern on top of a skeleton tower, and the light remained in service until 1963, and that's it standing next to the lighthouse building. With no one on the island, the simple house that the Lewis family had lived in began to decay, and a group of prominent Newporters, led by railroad magnate and Newport summer resident Arthur Curtis James, decided to take action. Money was no object, as James happened to be one of the wealthiest men in the country. The government was using only a little portion where the skeleton tower stood, and so they said, all right, we'll sell it, but a group of local fishermen decided that they wanted it too, and so it was put up for auction in New York. The well-to-do Newporters prevailed, and they bought Lime Rock and the light station building for $7,200. And shortly thereafter, in 1928, the Ida Lewis Yacht Club was born. Arthur Curtis James's beautiful brigantine yacht Aloha became the club flagship. James had served as Commodore of the New York Yacht Club, and he was named first Commodore of the new Ida Lewis Club. A close tie was established and continues to be maintained with the NYYC to this day. They've been coming to Newport since 1844 on their summer cruises. The summer home of the Yacht Club, the Harbor Court Mansion, of course, is within sight of Ida Lewis Rock. The Ida Lewis Club members connected the rock to the mainland with a wooden walkway, and they continue to be active members in Newport's yachting scene, often in combination with the New York Club. Since 1995, they have sponsored a yacht race for teenage female sailors and presented the Claggett Trophy to the winners. This year, it was held on a regional basis. It'll be held nationally next year. Clearly atop the flagpole is the Club Bourget, that triangular flag with 18 stars, each representing a documented life saved by Ida during her 60-plus years at the light station. The little light tower stands prominently at the corner of the building. Those passing by the island will note the 4-foot square tower and the little lamp room. The Fresnel Lens lantern that Ida lovingly tendered is in a place of honor inside the yacht club, and in its place in the tower is a little electric lantern. For many years, the club, with permission of the Coast Guard, would illuminate it as a memory to Ida between May and October. That is no longer the practice. The lighthouse is on the National Register of Historic Places, but with the exception of the wooden walkway and their colorful striped awning, The house looks not too much different from the time it was occupied by the Lewises. In 1995, the Coast Guard commissioned the first of a new class of buoy tenders called the Keeper class, named in honor of famed lightkeepers, and fittingly, Ida was the first to be recognized. Today, the 175-foot Ida Lewis is home ported in Newport and is a familiar sight on Narragansett Bay and up and down coastal New England. Also fittingly, the crew of the Ida Lewis has taken on the upkeep of Ida's gravesite in the common burial ground. Doubtless, she would not have expected that kind of attention. And yet, in another special recognition in 2018, she became the first woman to have a roadway at the Arlington National Cemetery named in her honor. Until then, all of the more than 40 roadways have honored men. The Secretary of the Army personally approved the name of Ida Lewis and Marine Gunnery Sergeant Jonathan Clifford, who was killed in Afghanistan in 2012, to have the streets in the new cemetery named in their honor. Although the Ida Lewis Lighthouse is no longer an active aid to navigation, it is a must-see for the thousands of visitors who tour the bay each year. Lighthouse enthusiasts come from around the country and around the world. They ride with us on the Rhode Island Fast Ferry Lighthouse cruise to get a sense of what life is like in these sentinels. And I am always amazed at the questions people ask me as the narrator of the cruise. And I look forward to sharing their tales, more of their tales with you in beautiful Narragansett Bay and its light. Well, as we've seen, it wasn't uncommon for a woman to serve as a lightkeeper. Because of her daring rescues, Ida arguably became the best-known female keeper and gained worldwide fame. But from her early teenage years to her death, she remained totally devoted to her light. A shy and unassuming individual, she was cast into a spotlight she never sought or enjoyed. She willingly maintained the harsh and often isolated life of a lightkeeper. Other women across the country braved the elements. They did rescue people in danger, but none ever captured the imagination and adulation of so many people as Ida Lewis. Her true happiness was in her work. In 1907, she wrote, "I am happy. There's peace on this rock that you don't get on shore. There are hundreds of boats going in and out of this harbor in summer, and it's part of my happiness to know that they are depending on me to guide them to safety." As the New York Times once said of her, she never hears the voice of distress night or day without jumping into her little craft and proceeding to the scene of trouble. There have been many other lady lightkeepers over the years, but for certain there has never been another like the heroine of Lime Rock Light, the Grace Darling of America, Idawalley Zoradia Lewis. Thank you for letting me share her story with you tonight.